Oklahoma. And my biggest struggle when I teach these courses, especially in parts of the United States where people don't have exposure to other cultures or other countries, is to avoid this kind of us and them and cultural superiority, especially, where, you know, we are free, especially when it comes to gender issues. We have done this. Of course, there's a huge difference and disparity between the legal system in the United States and the way that it guarantees rights for women and minorities and the way the legal systems we're still working on in the Middle East and North Africa. But it doesn't help any kind of teaching environment to have this, oh, everything is great here and you guys over there, you know, we'll rescue you somewhere down the line. So my challenge was to connect my students on a human level with what is happening in the Middle East, and the Iraq War especially, because many of them come from military families, and many of them have families who either continue to serve in the armed forces, the United States Armed Forces, or who are actually in Iraq. So my challenge then is to, okay, you saw the Iraq invasion and war from your perspective as a young white American woman or man. Here's another perspective to see it. And so I assigned them Riverbend's blog, because it's now available in book form. And their assignment was to read the entire blog, 2 volumes of the books, and to write a review for the class. And of course, this is what I wanted, and thank God they were smart enough to do this. Many of them wrote in their book reviews that, as I was, you know, they were at the time of the invasion of Iraq, they were 14 years old. This is back in 2003. So by the time I got them, they're about 20, 21. And just about every single review came back with at least this paragraph written in various ways. I had to stop reading Riverbend's blog because it was so painful to read about the bombings, to read about what life was like for this young woman in Iraq, because I had never read this or heard about this in the media. And they would say, I was 14 years old at the time, I wasn't very politically aware, you know, I could hear my parents talk about the war and the invasion of Iraq. I heard President Bush at the time justify it, but you know, I wasn't really aware of what was going on. And now reading her blog, you know, it really shakes me into rethinking what was happening back then, and it takes me all the way back, and it makes me rethink my administration and its positions and the way it tried to justify those positions. As I said, I couldn't have asked for more, and this came from a blog written by a woman who I don't know because I've never met. I emailed her a few times when she still wrote her blog, but her identity has been verified by her publisher, because she's been published in book form, as I mentioned. She's been given various awards, and she and other bloggers who wrote anonymously during the time of the occupation of Iraq, some of their blogs are going to be turned into films. But look at that. I mean, stop and think about the power of this one Iraqi woman who says, all you need to know is I survived the war, I'm 24, and that's it. And her ability to touch my group of young Americans in Oklahoma and make them think back in history and wonder what my government did in my name. And that's the power of the I. When someone goes online and says, you must listen to my story because I count. The other uses of I's that are just as subversive, I mean, this is subversive in international and kind of geopolitical terms. Another use of the subversive use of the I is clearly that when sexual minorities in the Middle East and North Africa use it, because I've showed you Saudi Arabia and more kind of the gender politics in Saudi Arabia. I've shown you Iraq and the geopolitical use of the I and the importance of the I, especially from a woman, because if anyone's voice during wartime is silenced the most, it's usually the voices of women. You hear about men in combat, you see visions of men in combat, you even heard the voices of the other side in the Iraq War, when you saw insurgents and the insurgent videos, and that was the way that they were answering back to other media. But where were Iraqi women? Who was giving Iraqi women a platform to speak? Riverbend was just one of many. There were many others, of course, who didn't have a chance. And she acknowledged that, you know, I come from an educated family, we have a generator so that when power supply is down, I can go online. But there were many that we didn't hear from. So, and this is where I count, especially during wartime, and especially when you belong to a minority that is in physical danger. And sexual minorities in many parts of the world are in physical danger. And one such part of the world, obviously, is the Middle East and North Africa. And one collective that I'm a huge fan of, that has started to speak out very clearly over the past few years, is one called MOV00538 that is based in Beirut, Lebanon. Could we go to the third slide, please? Yes, thank you. Excuse me. Now, MOV00538 is the Arabic letter for M, basically. And there's a reason that they chose the Arabic letter for M. For a long time in Arabic, and this is a lovely example of how language often has to catch up with the reality on the ground. For a long time in Arabic, we didn't have a word for feminism. So the concept, the idea, the demand for women's rights, as I said, has existed for a long time, but we didn't have a word for it until someone came up with the word Nasawiyya, which is the word now recognized for feminism in Arabic. For an even longer time, we didn't have a word that was not an insult to represent same-sex relationships, be they gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, queer, the queer experience essentially. So we had words that were very insulting, like pervert, like deviant, and those were the only words. And then someone came up with a literal translation of the phrase same-sex. And for a man that would be mithli, and for a woman that would be mithliya. And that literally means same-sex. And that's where meme got their name, meme for mithliya. Meme broke away from the first kind of open, basically gay rights movement that was again launched in Lebanon, because Lebanon has a greater kind of space, cultural space especially, and also political space to have an open gay movement. And that movement was called Hilm. And the reason that meme broke away from Hilm was for gay and lesbian and just queers generally in Lebanon, was that women felt, even in this movement for sexual minorities, they felt that men were speaking for them too much. Men were speaking all the time, and women had to speak, had to fight for space basically. So the women broke away and formed meme. And what meme did is they moved between the real world and the virtual world in this kind of beautiful way that again speaks to the power of the eye to find a place online that it doesn't have in the so-called real world. But you must take out that eye into the real world if you really want to help someone who is in physical danger or who feels alone and feels isolated. So meme has a website, and you are invited, if you are in Lebanon and you are lesbian or bisexual or transgendered or just questioning, and you write to them, and they will respond to you anonymously, and then they will arrange to meet you for coffee somewhere public. And once they figure out that you are real and you're not some person kind of trying to infiltrate the movement, they will give you a password to use so that you can then enter their virtual space and communicate with them on a name-to-name basis, not anonymously anymore. And you can use a house that they have set up for women. It's like a safe house, but it's not necessarily a shelter. But it's a house that offers counseling services at very, very low rates and for free for those who need it. It's called Women House, women with a Y, the kind of the old feminist, second-wave feminist spelling of women. And so counseling services, a library, and then what they did was, as part of collecting stories from across Lebanon, that was also a way of destroying the stereotype that being gay or being lesbian is Western, and that we import it from the West, because there's no such thing as being a lesbian in Lebanon, and that it's only something that the privileged upper classes have, or that it belongs to a particular religion or a particular background. What they did is that they sent a team out to the whole country to collect stories from Sunni, Shia, from the rural, from the urban, from all over Lebanon basically, to represent the lesbian, bisexual and transgendered experience, and they put it together in a book called Barid Mistajib. So this is where they became now real form. They moved from the virtual world into the real world. And my first experience with this book was my first experience with Beirut. I first visited Beirut in May of 2009. And the first thing I did that night could only happen in Beirut. And that was the book launch for Barid Mistajib. At the time, could only happen in Beirut. I'm hoping it happens in Cairo, in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Syria, in many places. But back in 2009, it could only happen in Beirut because of that greater movement or ability to move culturally and politically that Lebanon offers. And they launched this book at a stage very similar to this, where there were two women who openly identify as lesbian, one reading in English, one reading in Arabic, from this book of oral narratives of the lesbian and bisexual experience in Lebanon. And the stories were incredibly moving because, as I said, they came from across the country, various parts of the country. I will read you a small section from just a few of them. And they didn't just deal with the experience in Lebanon, but let me just give you a few lines. This is an excerpt from the story God's Will. My mother is a devout Muslim woman. Her belief in God is so powerful that she surrenders everything to His will. Anything that happens is because God wills it. and so she didn't question or challenge my homosexuality. Allah Haik, I can't read the other word. Anyway, basically her mother says to her, that's just the way that God made you. She told me it made no sense for her to try to change God's will. Shortly after I told my father, and he had the same reaction, we cannot change what is God's will. If it's meant for you to change, you will change on your own. This is an odd reaction for Muslim parents who usually get scared of their children's actions being sinful. Not my parents. When they thought about it and discussed the matter between themselves, they deduced that my living a lie was a bigger sin than my sexuality. They told me that it was better for me to be honest with myself and my parents than to be a hypocrite. Now, just digest that paragraph. The number of stereotypes that paragraph unpacks about Muslim parents, about coming out to your parents in a Muslim environment, about just coming out. Now, by no means are all the stories in this book this positive, because there are many stories in there of women and the transgendered saying, there is no way I can come out to my family, they will kill me. And others saying, when I came out to my family, they totally disowned me. But I read this paragraph to you especially because they find stories there too that you normally don't come across, that do challenge stereotypes inside Lebanon and outside Lebanon of what Muslim parents, of how Muslim parents would react to their daughter saying to them, I am a lesbian. And the other way that this book also challenges stereotypes is of what happens to some of the people in the book who move to the US or Canada or other parts outside of the Middle East and North Africa because they're sick and tired of living that lie. And so they go to the US and they think that coming out in the US as a lesbian woman is going to be great. They can live openly and they can live freely. But many of them arrived in the US in post 9/11 America, when it's not such a big deal to be a lesbian, but it's a huge deal to be an Arab, and it's a huge deal to be a Muslim. And then they find themselves having to challenge a whole bunch of other stereotypes. And this is a huge challenge right now for the queer Muslim movement in the US, and it does exist. There are queer Muslim groups in the US who recognize that they have to juggle many things, and many bigotries and many groups that are discriminating against them. Because it's one thing to be Muslim, it's one thing to be queer, and it's another thing having to deal with either the bigotry from within the Muslim community and the discrimination and bigotry from without the Muslim community. So that's what this book also collects, in that some of those women or the transgendered who moved to the US thinking they would find kind of sexual freedom or the ability to really be themselves, moved back to the Middle East and North Africa because they were sick and tired of constantly having to fight against the discrimination that Arabs and Muslims feel in the United States. So that's Meme and that's their book. My next example to you of, I'll go to Egypt next. Because one of the bloggers that Courtney mentioned is one of my favorite bloggers called Wahda Masriya, who's a friend of mine her name is Shahnaz Abdussalam. And Shahi, as her friends call her, was one of 4 women on a panel for female bloggers that I moderated in Cairo, I think in 2008 or 2007. And Shahi's experience was great because she told us how she's from Alexandria, and before she moved to Cairo, she would take the train from Alexandria to march in the street protests of 2005. 2005, as Lena mentioned, was a great year of street protests, of flourishing of the online scene. It was unfortunately crushed, but it was one of the many catalysts that led the way to the revolution that we're now living in Egypt. So Shahi was one of the people who would take a train from Alexandria, come all the way to Cairo, demonstrate and march and chant down with Hosni Mubarak, and then she would go home and blog about it under her blog called Wahda Masriya, which is Egyptian Arabic for an Egyptian woman or an Egyptian girl. And she said how one of the demonstrations, this young man came up to her and he said to her, "Are you Wahda Masriya?" And she said, "Yes." And he said to her, "You're the reason that I'm here." He said, "I came to this demonstration and I started coming out to these demonstrations against Mubarak, even though I've never protested before, because I found your blog. And I kept reading your blog and about how you took the train all the way from Alexandria to Cairo to come and march. And I thought, if a girl can do this, then I'd better do this, you know? It embarrassed me. He said, it embarrassed me that I'm sitting at home and you're writing about this. So you use what you can, you know? If you can go